Thank you for joining me today. My name is Wendy Mock, and I work in the Technical Consulting Department as a Senior Manager. I'm going to go through some of the most common trends in the packaging industry that are leading to either device recalls or formal 483 letters from the FDA. The topics I'm covering today include specific areas of the CFRs that relate directly to packaging. I will also go through a significant amount of data that has been gathered from the FDA website, outlining common occurrences that have been cited as part of specific 483s and or company-driven recall notices. Finally, I will take a look at covering applicable tests that can mitigate many of these findings. First, let's talk about what is a 483. A 483 warning letter is the result of an observation that is documented on a form, which is specifically a 483. It communicates concerns discovered during facility inspection. The form may identify deficiencies in your quality system or conditions that violate the Food, Drug, or Cosmetic Act and will require an initial response within 15 days. Recalls, however, occur when a medical device is defective or represents a risk to patient health or injury, and are usually conducted voluntarily by the device manufacturer or distributor. So now that we have an understanding of what a 483 or a device recall is, let's start to understand some of the areas specifically called out in the CFR document that are applicable and usually cited when issues are observed. 820.130 device packaging is about ensuring that the packaging in the shipping container is designed and constructed to protect the device. This can be accomplished through the careful selection of appropriate test methods that challenge the device and demonstrate compliance or potential issues. 820.30 design and 820.72 inspection, measuring, and test equipment. Both of these go hand in hand as they are associated with the creation of packaging. 20.30 specifies that the design and development of packaging and shipping systems shall be validated. This is even more apparent with the release of the revised 11607 and its focus on demonstrating usability of the package design. 20.72 drives that all equipment shall be suitable for its intended purpose, meaning that the sealer you use for creating the final seal is not something that's purchased off of eBay or Uline. It has to be capable of producing valid results through the use of control parameters. Additionally, any calibration standards or records that are used must be traceable to national or international standards. 20.75 addresses validation of the packaging process. Packaging-related issues is one of the top reasons for most recalls due to lack of sterility assurance. When a packaging system meets the requirements for design, performance testing, stability, etc., it is then considered a validated sterile barrier system. Any changes to the original validation can affect the integrity of that packaging system and should be assessed for risk or possibly revalidated. 20.70 addresses production and process controls, such that validation activities must be documented and performed by qualified personnel. Ensuring conditions are compatible with the selected materials needs to be controlled and monitored by and reliably produce systems that protect the medical device. If these processes are not in place, it becomes easy to create packages that do not comply with the established validation activities. The next few slides are going to represent observations made by the FDA with data that is specifically selected from 2016 and 2017 and was provided for discussion by Pat Lixel. A review of the information from 2018 and 2019 demonstrates the same overall trend. Just to give you an idea of how many data points are available, I filtered through 23,000 items to determine applicable categories, as the database consisted of any and all recalls, etc. One interesting point that did become apparent when looking at the data is that design control and validations continued to increase as the highest offender as the years continue to increase. Let's look at some of these observations in detail. The highest quantity of issues has been seen with design. This is further broken down into 3 areas. Configuration changes, such as possibly a customer changed the packaging configuration. For instance, there was a larger box that had 9 more devices, or a pouch change and no verification or validation was completed. Finally, 483 was issued to a company where used a sterile barrier that was smaller, but there were no test results around the seal strength available to demonstrate this was an acceptable design change. When broken down into sterilization, we can see that a specific client experienced a dose increase of 10 kilogray and made a package design along with that change. No assessment was made whether this affected the packaging or the product, or whether they needed to revalidate. Finally, under design, shelf life changes. There was a citation where a 2-year real-time shelf life testing was done at 12 months and 30, where there was a failure at 30 and no investigation was conducted around that failure. In other cases, shelf life stability testing was not done, or there was an increase of shelf life testing and there was no testing associated with that. Also, testing was done by the supplier. However, the manufacturer's equipment or sterile barrier system didn't match the data supplied by the supplier. And then finally, expired product was re-sterilized and given another 2-year shelf life. However, there was no data provided or a risk assessment associated with that. Looking at process validations, this was the second highest area of concern. Looking at sealer qualifications, it was identified that no documentation around the sealing machine met the specifications. Additionally, something as simple as the sealer not being validated for temperature range was used in a manufacturing environment, or the sealing process was not validated. Additionally, the temperature range again was not qualified or used as part of the performance qualification versus the operational. We're seeing a lot of packaging validations right now where we're working through determining acceptance criteria only to find out that the sealer was never qualified to begin with. So additional items that fall under the process validation category include a performance qualification didn't include a large or small packages or did not justify the packaging that was tested. The equipment was not installed in the correct manufacturing site, change was not addressed. The validation did not cover all configurations. First testing was not documented for the sealing validation, and then finally, multiple runs were not conducted with no rationale for sample size. Again, the ISO 11607 does state that a sample size must be justified, documented. Looking at production and process controls, it was noted that an oven used as part of accelerated aging was not qualified, that the sealers in the clean room were actually capable of producing contaminants, that a blister tray had no maximum sealing parameter. So there was significant overseals, which can create integrity breaches. And then finally, there was no procedure for monitoring those sealing parameters. Additionally, it should be noted that under these production process controls, temperature readouts were not documented and calibration for temperature probes were also cited. Looking at suppliers, there was no evidence that the suppliers used a validated packaging procedure or process, and that under inspection and test equipment, inadequate instructions for maintenance of that sealing machine were not established. So as you can see, there was a significant amount of very easily addressed 483 observations. We'll get into what testing needs to be in place after evaluating our recall. Let's take a look at the recalls. As a refresher, these are usually voluntarily actioned. These categories are sorted using a defect failure point rather than a high-level classification such as design or supplier's process. So it's a little more in-depth and focused. A few significant categories that pop out right away are, you can see there's an increase in packaging issues associated with tears. Looking at tears, you can see there's a 350% year-over-year increase. Seals were increased by 140%, and then punctures increased by 50%. The unknown category is recalls that are usually related to seal integrity, but those may be reduced. Let's take a look at what those details mean. Inadequate design indicates devices puncture pouches, device cracked blister packages, or the device rubbed against the pouch causing abrasion. There was also a recall for cap size was not properly seated. The device was moving during shipping, which created a puncture. And then also it was observed that protective coverings came off, which also punctured the sterile barrier system. Additionally, a packaging system design required folding. This material was specifically Tyvek, and therefore could lend to the phenomenon that's very well published, associated with sheet separation. And then we also had failed distribution and simulation testing. Looking at the recalls associated with production and process controls, you can see that the validation decreased to 2017, whereas now it was more segregated into, it was identifiable that we got more seal as far overall, but in general from year to year it decreased. So there was an improvement in the production and process recall. Let's take a look at those in detail. Out of the items that were identified, a quick review looking at the 2016 and 2017 versus 2018 and 2019, we have a significant increase up to 256 recalls in 18 and 254 in 2019, especially associated with the word seal. Looking at the equipment, several of those citations included debris on the sealer, the wrong sealing bar was installed, thus there was an incorrect heat transfer. The conveyor used punctured the pouches as the sealing process was performed. The equipment didn't control or assess variations. The equipment was not validated, or the equipment was worn and caused uneven heating. So control of the equipment is a significant issue. Making sure that those equipment procedures and validations of the equipment in place is necessary. Looking at the material, there was significant identification of the SBS material thickness showing irregular heat transfer. The forming of the tray and the pouch created punctures or cracks. This is identified when you look at the actual forming process of trays. If it's not spec'd correctly, when the material actually is heated and formed into the tray, it can thin at corners. So it's important to make sure that you're working with a very knowledgeable contract packaging facility that will know exactly what those dimensions are at the corners and how to alleviate those crackings. Slicing of packaging material was observed, and then all required products were not in the SBS. Looking at a testing approach, the worst case product was not used. Aging and transportation testing was not available. SOP, labeling of the components resulted in compromising the sterile barrier inner pouch, where contacts of the seal from the outer pouch, they weren't packaged according to the correct specification. And then finally, inadequate training. We see this frequently, that especially when you're sealing pouches, a lot of the employees see the beginning of issues and in good faith adjust the parameters, not recognizing that they're actually moving outside of the validated system. And so inadequate training pops up frequently. Here are the results for the supplier recalls. You can see the trend from seals increased from 10 to 51. Punctures decreased. Tears became less significant, but we now have the incorporation of this other category. Let's look at the seals. The seal process was deficient. The seals opened under shipping conditions, so as they were performing their distribution and temperature cycling, the seals actually opened. The sterile barrier material still has cuts and tears. The rotated device within the SBS after it was sealed, so the package was probably too large, and it allowed the device to move inside the package, which created issues with the seal. A contract manufacturer sterile barrier system punctured during shipping. The employee during the sealing process was not holding the pouch correctly, so again, we've got some training there. A born sealing plate was used. The packaging change was not validated. And then seals were on a reusable sterilization container were not validated. So these all resulted in supplier recalls. These are recalls due to employee errors. So in 2016, there were 192. In 2017, there were 4. So there was a significant move towards reducing this item. Employee technique was listed as one of the options. Sealing and visual inspections were not conducted as their SOPs indicated. There was the ability of mixing sealed and unsealed products. There was misalignment. The sealer was not turned on. And then product in the sealing area was we had incorrect segregation of sealed and unsealed again, and then the wrong sealing technique. So it's a lot of improvements in the employee areas. Other items that were highlighted include packagings were sealed outside of validated parameters. During the sealing startup, the tensile specification was not met, and the equipment was adjusted, but it wasn't documented. So it wasn't verified that it was within the parameters. Non-conforming product required 100% inspection, and this was not performed or documented. And then again, a number of defective packages were not documented. So let's get into how do we change this trend. As you saw, the majority of these focused on issues with design, in process, and validation. Let's look at some of the packaging test methods that are outlined in 11607 that are specifically designed to alleviate these types of issues. First, make sure that all of your packages are evaluated through all intended process. This does include sterilization, handling, distribution, storage, and that all materials are included in the evaluation. If there's IFUs, the labeling is in, all of the boxes, all of it needs to be evaluated. When you look at a basic validation plan, we're looking at a 3-tiered table. A validation is supported by integrity, microbial barrier, and strength tests. The overall effectiveness of the packaging system is evaluated. It is evaluated using those 3 pillars or properties, and it needs to be evaluated through the expected use by date or the end of life shelf date. When performing the testing, it's important to make sure that any test method is validated for use in your facility or with your equipment. And we're talking about repeatability, reproducibility, and sensitivity. Precision and bias statements are now found in the standards and help assess that variability found in the results. For example, if you are doing a verification of testing with your facility and an external laboratory, and the data comes back, not only verifying that you're following exactly the same methodology and test sample setup, but making sure that the precision and bias established from those methods is equivalent. It's also important to remember that some of the test methods are actually processes that prepare the materials for evaluation. They do not provide results. Accelerated aging is a great example of that. We are processing them to be evaluated by test methods. When we look at the seal, there are several items that came up during those device recalls or 483 observations, specifically directed at validation of the seal. It is important that the equipment and the process be validated before embarking upon a validation of the entire sterile barrier system package after sterilization. This includes the IQ, OQ, PQ. The installation of the equipment in its location. Do you have the correct electrical? Do you have the correct air if it needs air? All of those things need to be performed as part of the installation. The second phase is the operation. Does it do what you're supposed to do? If it's 250 degrees, does it create a temperature of 250 degrees? Does it hold down the temperature for 5 seconds? Things like that. Does it operate the way that it's supposed to operate? This is also where you can take a look at evaluating different temperatures across the pouch, just so that you can dial in what optimal sealing temperatures and times are. The next phase is the performance. This demonstrates that you can create the same seal over the period of multiple shifts, multiple days, and multiple operators. A lot of times this also includes the evaluation of post-distribution testing, post-sterilization testing. Let's look at the tests that we use to evaluate seal strength or seals. One of the tests that's very common is visual inspection, ASTM F1886. This visual inspection is a methodical process of examining a package for a specific amount of defects. I'm going to go through a few of those defects. The analysts definitely need to be trained on this. It's very easy that a specific analyst will evaluate a package and not see something, and then possibly another analyst could see something. There should be adequate lighting. It usually takes between 1 and 5 minutes per sample, and you usually document any observations with writing and pictures so that you can come back and evaluate the observations at a later date if issues are observed with seal strength or dye migration testing, for example. This is an example of an open seal or unsealed area. As you can see, we have a void space here. This can happen because the pouch is not aligned correctly in the sealer, or there's an equipment malfunction where this part of the sealer platen or the sealer bar is not at the right temperature or isn't working. There could have been defects within the material or the foreign body in the seal, or if this was post-distribution, it could have been a result of a seal rupture. Non-homogeneous or undersealed areas are represented by the top seal. You can see how it looks like a blue sky with clouds across it. This is a good example of non-homogeneous and can be result from improper heat or pressure or short dwell time. It's usually improper sealing. The bottom tray you can see has a very nice solid blue, which is a good representative of a good seal. Oversealing is a result of using too high of a sealing temperature, which causes melting or bending and definite voids in the seal. You can see how this Tyvek pouch is now deformed and that there are actually holes through the seal. This is an example also specifically of using equipment that is not designed for the material. After we've dialed in our visual characteristics, we now evaluate the strength and integrity properties. This can be done using ASTM F88. It determines the strength of the seal at a specific place on the packaging. We use a 1-inch seal of the segment. We pull it apart. It can be performed on porous or non-porous tests, and it determines the amount of strength it takes to open a seal. This is the dye migration test, and it uses dye. You inject dye into the package. So after we've determined that the strength of the package is adequate, now we want to make sure that we didn't create any integrity breaches. And dye is a really good method for that. We use the solution against the seal, and it's for a specific length of time, no more than 5 seconds per side. If dye migrates through the seal, then you have detected a failure. There are different dye fluids for porous and non-porous methods. So it's important to make sure that you are using the right material with the correct dye fluid. Both the seal integrity and the seal strength, combined with the visual inspection, will allow you to create a great check on your equipment and are part of the sterilization, validation, sterile barrier system validation. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about accelerated aging. There was a significant amount of citations associated with the establishment of shelf life or the lack thereof of evidence. Accelerated aging is regulated by ASTM F1980, and it demonstrates that the packaging is not affected by the aging process through its expected shelf life. Accelerated aging does not replace real-time aging. Real-time aging is the requirement. Accelerated aging is optional. And it uses the observations of Arrhenius, or the calculations that state for every 10 degrees that you increase above ambient conditions, that you can half the shelf life. So this is a chemical reaction. Instead of looking at this equation and doing the calculation, however, if you go to our website, you can find this chart, which determines the calculations for you quickly. Looking at the most common calculation, 55 degrees Celsius, you can see that it only takes 6.5 weeks to accelerated age a 1-year shelf life. It is important that the test conditions and the duration are justified. The FDA in the document recommends that 25 degrees ambient is recommended. The aging temperature should also be justified. It is not appropriate to pick temperatures because you don't have time to perform the testing. Relative humidity also needs to be considered. The standard currently calls out that relative humidity is to be used with caution, because there are materials out there that don't work very well and are aggravated with relative humidity. But there are also materials that operate on the opposite side, where they need the relative humidity conditions, and being placed into a low humidity creates issues that would not normally be seen in the environment. It's also important that you stay focused on the thermoglass transition point, or the T sub G. If you get too high of a temperature in the accelerated aging conditions, then what you get when you're done with accelerated aging is just a big blob, or issues that are created that are not relevant or seen in real-time environments. The other question is whether you should do the aging with or without product. The presence of a device can create stress on a package. If your product is not something that is easily created or is very expensive, the use of facsimile or simulants is accepted, as long as you justify why. So let's look at worst case sterile barrier systems. According to the standard 11607, when similar medical devices use the same system, a rationale establishing those similarities and the identification can and shall be documented. These can look at things like the medical device. Is it a heavy or is it light? Does it have sharp components? What types of materials are the packaging systems made out of? Did you evaluate single or multiple sterilizations? And then when you're looking at the distribution, are you looking at a worst case distribution cycle or assurance level, or are you going with a low conservative value? Additionally, the most common approach is to use systems with nominal operating conditions. However, there are also the option to use the lowest validated temperature pressure or use multiple sterilization exposures. This is most commonly, like I said, everybody uses nominal. However, if you are interested in evaluating these, you can use process limits. But the downside to that is the sample size and number of lots increases. And so you increase the amount of testing that is performed. Revalidation was also cited as a failure point. It's important to remember that if you make any changes to the sterile barrier system, that especially like if you change the equipment that seals it, for example, or the materials, anything that would compromise the original validation that established the sterile barrier system. So the process equipment, the device, the sterilization, etc., like I said, those would require a risk assessment and possibly revalidation testing. It is important to remember that some changes may not be requiring a validation. However, if you do that frequently enough, several of these small revalidation or changes that don't require revalidation could combine to create a situation where you do need to create some additional testing. So it's important to make sure that all the engineers that are making these small either marketing changes or customer-driven changes, that the communication level is there and that you're evaluating all changes throughout the year to ensure that this does not compromise your validation as it's established. So that brings us to the conclusion regarding our 483s. I do want to point out that we do have several more educational opportunities, seminars, white papers, etc. They're available, and you can access those by visiting our website at nelsonlabs.com, and then at the top of the page you'll see an education tab. If you're interested in additional information regarding contract sterilization, please visit also our sister company, whose website is sterigenics.com/resources. And additional, here is my contact information. If you have any questions about the information that was presented here today, you can reach out to us and we would be happy to help. Thank you for your time.